welcome back to those of you who have been to a VICTR event before. It's great to have you back. And for those of you who haven't, let me just tell you a bit about VICTR, who we are and what we do. So VICTR is the Virtual International Consortium for Truth Research, which is an online community of scholars with an interest in the value and nature of truth broadly construed. And we welcome anyone with an interest in these issues. Our mission is to give researchers a platform for sharing their work with a virtual community of colleagues, independent of geographical location and institutional affiliation, to foster an environment of critical constructive feedback, to promote gender, racial and ethnic inclusivity amongst those doing work on truth, and to support research in all areas of the philosophy of truth. We are generously supported by the Future of Truth project at the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute, the University of Waikato, and the University of Alabama. We have a VICTR mailing list, a website, a Facebook group, Twitter and YouTube channel, which has some of our videos from our recent Truth 2020 conference there. And with more to come soon, you may be seeing some links to these in the chat. Our next event after this one is on December the 15th at 10 AM Eastern. Sharif Gamal Salem will be presenting a talk called On Modal Truth, and that's also in the chat for you there. So today we're going to be talking about truth and polarization, and really obviously this is a pop-up panel. We put this together pretty quickly in light partly of kind of recent events. Obviously the issue of polarization from a political perspective is not something that's particularly new, and disagreement in general, like intractable disagreements and how to deal with those, particularly as they affect our capacity to discover truths, is not something that's particularly new. And indeed, many of the people we'll be hearing from today have talked a lot about this in their past work. But after kind of a few years now of this kind of almost like post-truth era of politics, or you might even call it a kind of proto-fascist era of politics, we have reached a kind of almost a critical point where things are starting to look very, very worrying, right? So if you think about the recent presidential election in the United States, we're in a situation now where if you kind of take the polling that's done now seriously, where an alarming percentage of people who voted for Donald Trump but say that they believe that there was widespread fraud in the election, even though there has been no evidence presented of that. And we face a kind of perhaps a crisis of political legitimacy if we have a large proportion of the country that's not accepting the results of a fair election. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic has seen polarization of a different sort, but equally, and perhaps even more so troubling, where we have people not accepting the scientific evidence that COVID is a threat, not taking it seriously, and lives being lost as a result. In short, we seem to be losing, or even further losing, this idea that there's some common ground of facts that we all can agree on, and then perhaps we can disagree about what to do in light of those facts. But without any common ground, we seem to lack the basic tools to function democratically, and that's obviously something that is a significant concern. So this panel today will be talking about these issues, and we are very fortunate to have some wonderful people here to talk about these things with us. We have three special guests who all are leading research projects on issues connected to what we'll be talking about today. And we also have some members of our VICTR steering committee who are, of course, all significant scholars working on truth in their own right. So we have our special guests. We have Maria Baghramian from the University College Dublin, who is the principal investigator of the European Commission's Horizons 2020 research project Policies, Expertise and Trust in Action. We have Michael Lynch from the University of Connecticut, who is the principal investigator of the Templeton Project Humility and Conviction in Public Life, and the co-principal investigator of the Future of Truth project. Joining us at 11 o'clock will be Cailin O'Connor from UC Irvine, who is co-principal investigator of the National Science Foundation grant Consensus, Democracy and the Public Understanding of Science. And from our VICTR steering committee, we have Bob Barnard from the University of Mississippi, Joe Ulatowski from the University of Waikato, and Chase Wrenn from the University of Alabama. And I'm very grateful to all the participants for agreeing to do this on such short notice. It's really wonderful to have you here. Just to give everyone a sense of the structure, we'll be taking about roughly half an hour for each to focus on each guest. So with Michael, Maria, and then Cailin, and then we'll have about half an hour at the end for kind of general open discussion with the audience. So so I'm going to turn to Michael Lynch first. So obviously this problem of truth and polarization is something that you've worked on for quite a while now. What's your particular take on the situation that we face now? How different is it from situations that we faced before? And how worried should we be about it?
All right, well, thanks. And thanks so much for inviting me to this, and to everyone who's organizing VICTR to this exciting session. I'm honored to be here with Cailin and Maria to talk about these issues. So let's start with the question of how different this is, and then a few remarks about whether we should be worried. My answer to that will be brief, as you'll see. So disagreement is not new in politics. Disagreement is healthy, in fact, in a democracy. And that includes pervasive, wide, entrenched disagreement over values. Very much democracy or democratic politics is a mechanism by which we can navigate those disagreements in a peaceful way without violence. What's partly different and alarming, and I think fascinating from a theoretical perspective about what's happening today is the kind of disagreement that we're in. And again, this kind of disagreement that I'll describe in a minute is not itself new, but the mechanisms by which it's spreading and sustained, I think, are new. So what sort of disagreement are we seeing? What sort of polarization are we seeing? Well, it's not just that we're disagreeing over values, and it's not just that we're disagreeing over facts, although we are, such as the fact of whether there was fraud committed in the election, which it appears that there wasn't. We're also disagreeing over our standards for deciding what a fact is. That is, over the reliability of certain social epistemic practices and which ones are legitimate. What sources of information should we see as reliable? We're disagreeing over these sort of our epistemic principles and our social epistemic principles. The problem is when disagreements reach that level of depth, when they go to that point where we're disagreeing over what counts as a fact and what doesn't count as a fact, it's very difficult to see how to dig ourselves out of that particular hole, because any particular arguments I make for my side to the other side are going to be viewed automatically as not just flawed, but possibly question-begging, because I'll be relying on sources and standards of information and standards of epistemic evaluation that the other side just doesn't accept and is in fact suspicious of. And that makes rational discussion of these matters very difficult indeed. So I think that's one thing that characterizes the type of, one type of disagreement we're in. I also think, as a lot of researchers have realized, is that we're also deeply divided in our attitudes towards one another. We're deeply divided in our attitudes towards each other's beliefs and our attitudes towards each other's epistemic states of mind. That is, this is what is often called affective polarization. We regard the other party not just as misinformed, but we regard them as dishonest, immoral, and somehow irrational. And that is, I think, important as well. The real difference, though, between these sorts, again, it's not as if Catholics and Protestants who were busy killing each other all over Europe, 400 to 300 years ago, were not also effectively polarized and epistemic disagreement. Of course, they were. So there has been, it's not as if this is the first time global culture has seen this sort of phenomenon. What's different, of course, is the mechanisms by which this polarization disagreement is prosecuted throughout the globe. And the particular difference that I think is worth flagging is the personalization of information. Everything that comes down your, everything you encounter online nowadays, all the news that comes down your Facebook feed, all the ads that you see, as we all know, are targeted, are personalized to fit your particular preferences. And as I like to say, that is great when you're shopping for shoes or books. It's not great when you're shopping for facts, because when you're getting the facts, the information that just fits your personal preferences, you're basically looking at a recipe not for bursting information bubbles, but expanding them. So I think that is my take on what's new here. And to the question of whether we should be worried, the answer is, well, yes, we should be worried. We should be very worried because this sort of, the democracy really, as Doug, you noted in the outset, democracy doesn't function or won't function as it should if participants in the democracy, or the citizens who are governed by the democracy, whether or not they participate, don't share some common reality, some sense of common reality. Without that, it's very difficult to see how to engage in the sorts of deliberative democratic procedures that are meant, as I said earlier, to resolve our differences without resorting to violence. So, I'll pause there in case people want to ask, you guys wanted to ask me questions and follow up. I have more to say about the types of philosophical problems, particularly with regard to truth, that this dynamic that I just described gives rise to. But I didn't know whether, and Doug, you wanted to follow up on any of that, or Maria, or anybody else.
Yeah, but Maria, did you want to come in on that?
So there's a lot in what Michael says that chimes with my thinking about it, but I like to answer your initial question about the differences and similarities between what's happening now and what has happened in the past from the perspective of truth rather than disagreement. And then maybe Michael and I will come to similar conclusions in certain ways. So just to go back 30 or 40 years or so to Hannah Arendt, who famously wrote that no one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on bad terms with each other, and no one, as far as she knows at least, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues. So this was, I mean, Arendt was obviously familiar with Nazi Germany and the way lies were used and propaganda was used, and she was seeing echoes of that in 1960s in America as well. Her point was that lies have always been a tool in the armory of politicians, and demagogues, and they have made use of it freely. So the connection between lies and politics has been there. Plato has talked about it in terms of the difference between truth and opinion, and so on up to recent times. But things are somewhat different now, or more than somewhat, quite radically different now, as far as I can see. People have discussed the era they call post-truth. Many commentators, many philosophers, social epistemologists, etc., have commented on that. But I think that's somewhat misleading, the term post-truth, because it implies that we have reached a state that's different, but maybe neutral, and maybe it's something like postmodernism. It's just a new phase of our epistemic existence, but it does not capture the dangers that this so-called post-truth poses for us. What is important to our current situation, and particularly to what is happening in the United States and then throughout the world, is that we have gone well beyond the deplorable but quite well-known habit of politicians to lie. That we know is the case, has always been the case. But what we are seeing now is this systematic and successful campaign to undermine trust in factual discourse. And I'm not sure if Trump just reflects this or is the master of performing this trick, but it has been hugely successful. And this is where I agree with Michael. The attempt to undermine the sources of information, the attempt to undermine the climate of trust that is needed for us to learn from each other, to take each other's statements at face value, to read the news and believe it, to listen to medical experts, to follow their advice. This sort of undermining of truth is what is different, as far as I can see, between what Hannah Arendt was discussing and what we are experiencing right now. And well, maybe others can come in on this point, and we can maybe discuss a bit more the role of truth in this particular form of politics that is being played out on a global scale.
I'd love to come, if I can. That was, I think, really right, exactly right. Everything that I agree with what Maria was talking about the differences. And I think she's completely right, especially given the focus of this project, to steer us exactly towards the question of truth in politics. I think that, particularly for this group of researchers, could be put like this. What, if anything, makes our political judgments true? Can they even be true? Much of what's happening in our society right now, the undermining of our faith in reliable social epistemic practices, as I would put it, underlying the value, what I would call the value of truth and democracy, that undermining of that active attempt to undermine the value of reliable social epistemic practices really raises a theoretical question as well. It raises a deep political question, an existential threat to our democracy, without a doubt. These are existential threats. They also raise, these existential threats are also, however, and this is important, really important point that I think it's important that I want to get across, are at the same time deeply complex philosophical problems. We are at a moment in culture where epistemology and the questions of philosophy of language have risen to the surface of the culture. And it is an absolute imperative for us to be thinking about these things, not just as democratic citizens, but as philosophers. And let me try to put some meat on that bone by making the question a little bit more precise. Let me do that by way of an example. So here's a famous pair of pictures that many of you have probably seen before. This is this one picture is, I'll leave you to guess which one, is from the Trump inauguration in 2016, or 2017 actually, and the Obama inauguration, I believe the one in 2012. Now, as famously, sort of day one of his administration, Trump, via his spokespeople, claimed that he had far more people attending his inauguration than Obama had. And this seemed to be very important. They repeated this over and over and over again, even in the face of documentary photographic evidence like this. And what's interesting about this particular pair of pictures is it's also been the subject of a study, well-known study by a couple political scientists who are up the road from me in UMass, Schaffner and Lux, in 2018. And what they asked is a very simple question. They asked the people who are in the study, the participants, the question of which one of these pictures has more people in it. And interestingly, people who voted, who self-identified as voting for Trump, were 6 times more likely than people who didn't vote or self-identified as voting for Clinton, 6 times more likely to say that the picture on the right side of the screen actually had more people in it. So that's a really interesting question. It's clear that that picture does not have more people in it. But in this case, the voters who voted for Trump were far more likely in this study, in similar studies, to say something that is obviously false. Why? Well, one possibility is that they've come to believe that reality is different, deeply different, or perhaps the laws of mathematics are different than, or the law, or what people are. They have some radically different views. Their beliefs are tied up in knots. But another possibility, and the one suggested by Schaffner and Lux, and the one that which I want to I'm building on here, is that, in fact, what's happened is that they're expressing not perhaps their beliefs, but in making that claim, they're expressing what I would call their conviction. And I think this question this point, and the polarization and the undermining of social epistemic practices that we've been talking about, really puts a fine point, in a way that I'll describe in just a second, on the question of political truth. Because what arguably is going on here is that it's a demonstration or example of the fact that when these sort of radical, bald-faced lies are perpetrated or expressed either by people in power or by their followers, that there's more than just simply expressions of belief going on. There may be for some people. I mean, people are different. So not everybody in the study who answered the same way are going to have the same cognitive psychology. But for many people, what they're actually doing is expressing what I call their convictions. And a conviction is it's not a belief. You could have a belief in what you also have a conviction about, but not necessarily. A conviction is a commitment towards, we might call an identity reflecting value. And by that, I mean that a conviction is a commitment to the kind of person, to a value that reflects the kind of person you want to be, and reflects the kind of world you want to live in, the kind of tribe you want to be associated with. Convictions, political convictions, are often what we're expressing when we're making our political judgments. And what that means is that political judgments are often aspirational. And that's important, because that means is that if political reality is partly a construct out of people's political judgments, then our political reality is partly a construct of our aspirations. And that raises a deep question of how it's even possible for our political judgments to be true. Now, in fact, I think they can be true, because I think what's true or false are propositions, but not just merely the judgings. But for those of us, most of us here have done a lot of work on semantics and metaphysics, and epistemology, and philosophy of language. I hope that you can see the sort of problematic I'm raising, which is that part of what the situation we're in is a divide between not just people with different beliefs, but divide between people who have different convictions, different aspirational views. And it's those views that they're expressing in their political judgments, but are also, of course, shaping their political actions. Because your aspirations are as deeply motivating, in fact, even more, one would think, more motivating than your actual beliefs.
Michael, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to lay that out as a central sort of concern I have about that in this topic. I hope that makes sense.
Michael, let me push you on this for a second, if I can.
Sure.
So I've heard you give this this explanation a couple of times now, and it's very attractive in certain dimensions. But it strikes me that one of the things that needs to be sort of teased out here is that truth as a value isn't something that people on both sides are disagreeing with, right? So if I accuse you of propagating fake news, right, what I'm really doing is I'm saying I'm better positioned to tell you about the truth, right? So people on both sides are holding up truth at least as a notional value. So how does this notion that truth is a value for both sides fit into this structure that you're laying out, or this account you're laying out, where people differ with respect to certain social epistemic values or principles, if truth isn't one of those.
Yeah,
you know, they agree about the importance of truth, but they're disagreeing about something else.
Yeah. So the question is, that's a really good question, and I think part of and I'd be interested to see what Maria thinks about this. But my partly because it's a super hard question, and I may not have an answer to it. So, but Maria is much smarter than me, and she will. I guess the question I want to push back on is the point I want to push back on is what it means to say that we both sides value the truth. I think in a certain way, that is certainly the case, in the sense that people care about having correct beliefs, and to have a correct belief is to have a true belief. So insofar as politics is concerned with belief, I think that it's almost axiomatic that both sides have a concern for truth. Part of what I'm trying to say, Bob, with my whole what seemed maybe like a digression into this question about political judgment and conviction, is to try to push back on the thought of whether really the right term to be thinking about when we're thinking about politics is belief, as opposed to judgment and conviction. Now, that's not to say, as I said, there's this, that there isn't such a thing as political truth. It just means that question of whether our judgments can be true or not in politics is a really difficult question. So what I want to suggest is that, okay, so that's one answer to the question. One way of answering the question. Another way of answering the question is this. When we talk about truth being a democratic value, what I mean by that is not that that democracies have a vested interest, qua democracies, in protecting, promoting, and allowing access to reliable social epistemic practices, where a social epistemic practice is a practice for producing beliefs that is partly dependent on the transfers of information between individuals. It's social. So I think democracies this talk about truth as a democratic value is not necessarily to say that the people within the democracy all equally value truth or value it as individuals at all. I think a lot of times, Bob, when we think about what's happening on an individual level, really what we're finding is that a lot of people participate in politics because of their convictions, and their convictions reflect their aspirations, not necessarily reality. I mean, when people say, for example, that there's been widespread fraud, many people probably believe that. A lot of people who say that, though, may be answering the question by expressing their conviction, by expressing how they think the world ought to be, not how it is. And politics is the realm of the ought, of how we think the world ought to be. That's what makes politics so intensely motivating, and the most powerful and most dangerous sort of activity that human beings can collectively engage in. I wish it was art, but it's politics. So I hope that was helpful.
It is, but it raises, and this goes back to one of the sort of thematic prompts that Doug put together for the panel about how we sort of move forward. In a sense, you've set up a framework in which, because everybody is sort of deeply sort of entrenched in these aspirational value structures, it becomes very difficult to consider the ways in which those groups might start talking to each other again, right? Because where's the common ground? And so what is the argument? I mean, we live in the realm of arguments. It does the presuppositions required for there to be argument back and forth, or sort of principled discourse back and forth, are extraordinarily limited. And it seems like the only place where there's agreement is in this concern for truth, but truth itself means something different to these people, to people on both sides. If you think that it's a bipolar sort of circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of what needs to be done moving forward, I have answers at the nitty-gritty level that are partly due to my work on the nature of information and the epistemology of the internet. So I have all sorts of sort of recommendations about social media and things that I think are helpful. I certainly think that one of the things that everyone here can do is to take an active effort in teaching their students about the personalization of the infosphere. I think that actually getting people to understand that is one of the most practical things that each and every one of us can do, to sort of get people to, for example, just sit down with your students in class and have them Google things and see what comes up. See how Google answers or completes their sentences. I found that to be really helpful. Sadly, though, I think a lot of the people that need convincing about that nowadays are people my age. When I go around and talk about these things around the world, it's perhaps not surprising that middle-aged white men seem to be, especially in America, the ones who seem to think they know everything about how the internet works when they know virtually nothing, which pretty much goes about everything about what middle-aged white men think, right? We think we know everything and basically know nothing. But getting off that high horse, I think as far as the more theoretical aspect of your question, I think what there's really puts the question that really you're getting at is, if politics is much of our political discourse is involved in making political judgments, which often express our convictions, our aspirations, then very much the move forward is to try to find some common aspirations. And you're putting your finger on one, which is truth. But there are other common aspirations as well. Aspirations for fairness, for example. A concept that was quite big in political philosophy in the 70s and has changed. I think we've all changed our relationship to, as political theorists, to what that Rawlsian project really should or ought to have been. But the concept of fairness, I think, is another one that is an aspirational concept that really needs an equality. Concepts like equality, concepts like a fairness, are concepts that I think are aspirational concepts, and political leaders, as well as political philosophers, need to start talking about those common aspirations. This is one of the things that made Barack Obama successful at getting, a large variety of white people to vote for him, including people that went back to voting for Trump. Trump and Obama were both very good at giving people a vocabulary about aspiration. Think about the titles of Barack's book, of Obama's book, Barack as if I know him. My buddy Barack. Think about the titles of his books and hope. So part of what I'm trying to get at is that, I suppose here is to say that the negative aspect of what we're talking about also has a positive aspect, because politics can be a vocabulary filled with vocabularies of aspiration, and what we need is people to rediscover that common ground of aspiration. But I realize I'm getting away from technical stuff to more political discourse. So, yeah, sorry.
I'd like to try to jump in here on a little bit of that, because I agree with you a lot that we need to find the common ground, the common aspirations. But one of the problems that we face is that not everybody agrees about who is part of that community of common aspiration. You're not going to find very many people who are looking for their common aspirations with Nazis. You're not going to find very many Nazis who are looking for their common aspirations with communists. They're just the enemy, and anything goes when you're dealing with the enemy. So I think that probably some community building is needed before we can worry a lot about the common aspirations. I would like to come back to the idea that the political judgments are expressing conviction, though. Because even if that's right, and I suspect that there's something very right about it, most people probably don't distinguish their convictions from their beliefs, and most people would likely think that their convictions are subject to the same kinds of truth norms as their beliefs, that there's that you've made a mistake if you have a conviction that isn't true. And so there may be their epistemic roots may be in our aspirations, but we seem to also want to hold them accountable to something beyond just expressing our aspirations. And so I wonder, once we take into account the idea that that convictions are answerable to some kind of a truth norm, don't we find ourselves back in a position where we have to deal with the stubbornness of dispositions with respect to evidence, and how we're going to convince people whose aspirational convictions involve oppressing others to quit it?
So I have things, those are great questions, Chase. Lots of things to say about that. But I wonder if Maria might want to come in here, because I know she's been thinking about the norm of truth in political discourse. So this seems to me a pitch right to her, if she is willing.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Maybe where I disagree with you and Robert is what the role of the norm of truth in the current political discourse. And maybe this is something that we need to look into. Is it really true that, as you had claimed in your writings, and also others like Crispin Wright and Bernard Williams, that the norm of truth is always added to our discourse? It's what truth is the norm of discourse, and also in your writings, in a much richer sense, is the norm that we should care about and follow. I still believe that's the right way to think about truth, but on the ground in politics, I don't think that's the case anymore. Maybe the most blatant example recently from Trump or his followers, but from the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, and its judgment about against New York's ban on attendance religious ceremonies. There, the judgment that they made basically was that if it is considered essential to go to a liquor store or to go to a bike shop, then surely it is also essential to allow people to go to church services or synagogues or mosques or whatever. What they failed to mention was the chances of catching COVID in a brief encounter. Buying a bottle of wine is far, far less than spending some time in the company of a possibly large crowd in a confined setting. But what that judgment showed was what for the current Supreme Court seems to be the higher value, i.e. the essential nature of religion. So that was the truth that they were testifying to, rather than the empirical truth that it is quite easy to catch COVID in confined spaces with large number of people present, as opposed to going into a shop and buying something or collecting your bike or leaving it there. Now, this was a measured judgment. After all, it was a judgment by the Supreme Court, but you can see many instances of that in the political discourse of today in America and elsewhere, in Britain as well, and in other countries, and not just in countries ruled by proto-fascists, as we were discussing earlier. So what is happening here? I think this is something that probably Hobbes knew well enough in the Leviathan, when he wrote that such truth as opposed no man's profit nor pleasure is to all men welcome. So what are the truths that are welcome to men? Well, for Hobbes, probably it was truths of mathematics and geometry. For the current political climate, it is the truths that speak to our values, the political values, as well as to our interests. The value of truth is subsumed. It's either subsumed under other values, ideological values, religious values, etc., or we think that there are higher values that reveal truth in a sense that factual accuracy does not. And this has been a common feature of talk of truth, the higher truth that speaks itself through the word of God or through the word of ideologies, but does not necessarily, is not necessarily reflected in empirical facts. So if what I'm saying is correct, then our thinking about truth may need to be changed slightly. That is, the emphasis of truth as a value now shifts from thinking of truth in terms of accuracy, accuracy to facts, accuracy to what is happening out there, to what speaks to our emotional needs, our political needs, our ideological needs, the needs of our peer group, the ones who will approve of us or will not approve of us, etc. Now, this is not the way I would like to think about truth as it is being played out there, but I'm starting to think that this is what's happening on the ground, regardless of how philosophers have characterized the role of truth in discourse. So I'd like to see what Michael would like to say about this notion of truth as not.
I think this Maria, this if I may, I think that I think we actually agree on these things, and we're finding out. At least I'm finding out more than I might have thought on this particular issue, because I still hold by my my older views that truth is a norm of belief. Now, part of this is how we use these terms, right? I mean, belief in philosophy lingo is a little bit different than how that word functions in a lot of ordinary English discourse, or just English non-philosophical discourse. So there's that question. But I mean, in the sense in which philosophers generally use the term, I think truth is a norm of belief, and I think truth is a goal of inquiry. But I do think that there is a really deep question about whether truth is a norm of our political judgments. Let me put it, I haven't reached a settled answer to that question. And it's very much, in part because, as Chase just pointed out, and you pointed out, there are strong pressures for us to say yes and no to that question. If truth is not a norm of our political judgments, then how do we make sense of the fact, as Chase just pointed out, that people do like to give reasons for their good or bad for their political judgments? How do we make sense of the fact that that we can understand courts like the Supreme Court in the United States weighing in on matters which pretty much everyone would agree are not just matters of law, but matters of politics? How can we make sense of the fact that, you know, our political judgments can be the antecedents of conditionals, for example, right? And things like that. I mean, it seems as if political judgments are apt for truth, and that they're also normatively governed by epistemic notions, at least. On the other hand, for all the reasons, many of the reasons that you just remarked, the kinds of truth that people are aspiring to in politics seems, you know, this sort of larger truth, this revealed truth, essential truth, truth with a capital T, is very far distant from the type of sort of more mundane philosophical notions that we have sometimes wrestled with. And we might wonder whether, as I was putting it before, whether really political judgments are in the game of truth falsity at all. I mean, to put my own cards on the table, I think what we need to do here is, as a philosophical theorist, is think deeply about what kind of truth, if any, political judgments are capable of. I do think, as a, you know, naturally, I'm here in looking to Doug Edwards as some reinforcements on this. As a pluralist about truth, I think that I have, when I ask that question, I have a few more possibilities at my disposal than people who are deflationists or, let's say, correspondence theorists about truth do. Because I think it's possible that what we might find is that political truth, that is the property that attaches, if at all, to our political judgments, is going to have a different character than the character that it has when it attaches to beliefs about the physical world. Now, one last complication, and one that Maria's points bring up very nicely, is that when we talk about a political judgment, we're not talking about something, a discourse, in the way that Crispin Wright talks about politics isn't a discourse in the way that, or a domain in the way that I've talked about it in previous work. It's not like when we think about the difference between mathematical claims and claims about the physical world, we're thinking about, we find the difference in the content of those claims. That is in their propositional content. That is in the concepts that compose those, you know, concepts like number versus concepts like grass. The content is what makes the difference. The content doesn't determine what makes a political judgment a political judgment. It's its function in our political economy. Because after all, here's an example. Here's an example. The proposition, or the judgment rather, the judgment that with this propositional content, climate change is real, or consider its negation. Those are, I think, nowadays, given current politics, functioning as political judgments. In fact, it would be very weird for any one of us to utter climate change is real outside of this context, except if we were engaged in politics, like holding up a sign with it written on it. I mean, you don't go around in scientific enterprise. It's not like the climate change, the climate scientists don't go around saying to each other in scientific discourse, you know, climate change is real. That's any more than people go around talking about oxygen being real. It's a settled question. So when we make that judgment in current discourse, we're typically, not always, but typically engaged in politics. What that shows, however, is that propositions which are true, presumably because, if they are true at all, because they correspond to the facts, can also be themselves propositions which are the content of political judgments. But those judgments might function to express our aspirational convictions as well. And so that they have, as we might say, political content. And I think all of that really puts this question of how we understand this pressing question of whether politics can have, as you said, Hannah Arendt's famous remark, quite apt right now. Nobody's ever thought that truth and politics were on good terms with one another. But maybe they're not on any terms at all. That's the question. And I think I wanted to say, my aspiration is to say that politics and truth can go together. But I'm trying to motivate people here to get gripped by the paradox that I see arising from these discussions that we're having.
I mean,
May I come back on this for a second?
Yes.
So what Michael is talking about, and we are in agreement that I thought we would be actually, Michael. But one example of political, that's actually factual truth as well, is this statement that Trump and his followers have been repeating, that Biden could not have gained 80 million votes. It just is not possible for someone like him to gain, to have received 80 million votes. So what sort of truth is that? So they are denying an empirical truth, but their reasoning is, well, goes beyond the empirical, but does have empirical elements in it as well. So I heard one of Biden's supporters arguing this way the other day on CNN, that, well, I went to Trump's rallies, there were so many people there. For Biden's rallies, no one showed up. So how could Biden have more votes than Trump? So this is really a factual disagreement in the service of politics. But I think what is happening there, part of what is happening there is that the ultimate overall truth that Trump is the much better politician, and what America aspires to, that's the overarching framework that decides the judgment and the reasons brought in favor of the empirical truth that there were 80 million votes for Biden or not. I don't know whether, Michael, you agree with this thinking?
Yeah, I do. The way I put that is, my lingo, is that often our political convictions determine they have us not just moral authority over our lives, they have epistemic authority. So they affect what we believe, not just what we judge in the technical sense I was using before, but actually what we believe. So when we talk about alternative realities, those alternative realities, there's one reality. I think we can all agree on that, at least here. Well, maybe there's some idealists, so I don't know. Actually, I take that back. William Alston once told me you should never, ever say that all philosophers believe X, right? That's never true. So take that back. Okay, but I believe there's one reality. When we talk about different realities, when we're talking about different belief systems, as you say, I think these convictions that convictions that reflect these aspirations of how reality ought to be, and reflect our values, those play an epistemic authoritative role over our cognitive lives, and that can be good in some ways and not so good in others. But that's how I would put it. So yeah, I agree that there is, in a sense, these certain bigger truths, these bigger important principles and convictions are guiding people's view about what is in fact happening.
So I wanted to just kind of on this issue of political truth and the idea that, you know, there's this political discourse and some claims that are political. I wanted to just kind of perhaps think about another kind of meaning of that, which I think maybe feeds into the opposition between truth and politics that Maria mentioned before, because sometimes what happens when people say, oh, well, look, you know, so take the climate change case, right? So climate change is real. Someone says, oh, well, hang on, that's a political statement. Or, you know, sometimes you see this in the Black Lives Matter protests, people making claims about institutional racism, and then someone says, oh, but, you know, why are you making this political? Why are you bringing politics into sport? And one way that sometimes is meant is like, it's taking something that is true, but then injecting it with an element of disagreement, right? That if you're saying, well, that's a political issue, you're saying, well, look, that's one side of it and other people disagree. So you're taking something that's a factual claim, like about climate change, and if someone says, well, that's a political issue, the thought there is, well, you know, other people with different political views disagree about whether climate change is real. Or if you say institutional racism exists and someone says, oh, hang on, that's a political issue, or the thought there is that, well, there are other people on the other side of the aisle or whatever that disagree. So it's not merely a factual claim anymore. So I guess one worry then is that whether this, like, the kind of labeling of something as a political claim is directly in conflict with the idea that it's something that is something that is at least accepted as true. It's injecting it with an element of controversy And by doing that, you can take seemingly innocuous claims about reality and immediately inject doubt into them just by calling them political. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, is that a different meaning of political than we've been talking about so far when we talk about political claims as expressions of conviction? Is it a way to, you know, would we be better off kind of moving away from labeling claims as political, especially when if it undermines the status of those claims as factual claims? I guess, yeah, I was just kind of interested to know what you guys thought about that dimension of like suddenly making something seemingly obvious, suddenly controversial, and it seems like we're going backwards.
Yeah, Maria, did you want to take that, or?
I'll just say something very quick, and then maybe you can come in as well. I think one of the main differences or interesting differences between the sort of politics of truth that Hannah Arendt was talking about and what's happening now is how even the most benign looking facts can be politicized. So the distinction between the factual and the political are disappearing, particularly in the States. So the treatment of the pandemic in America and wearing masks is actually a scandalous example of that. Now in Ireland, we also have oppositional politics. We have Sinn Féin, which is sort of the left, real left in Ireland in some ways, even though they're a nationalist party, and they are the opposition, and the centrist Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the other side. But one thing that they don't disagree about is how to deal with the pandemics, except that Sinn Féin insists on better support for those who are in political or economically disadvantaged. But in America, we see that something as simple as wearing a mask becomes a political issue rather than a medical issue. And that's what scares me about the politics of truth in America more than anything else, that this distinction between politics and the factual are just disappearing. There is no non-political discourse as such. All discourse is political, not just climate change, but also the simple fact of the transmission of this virus from person to person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both your worry about the example, and which I think neatly fits Doug's sort of question. But also, you know, with your worrying about that, I do think in other work of mine, I have also, like Robert Talisse as well, has been worried about this, of the over-politicization of our lives, particularly in the US. I think that is a symptom of the type of underlying epistemic disagreement that I was talking about at the very beginning. When the very standards for what counts as reliable information, the very standards of rationality, in a sense, are up for debate, or at least people don't share them, then it's much easier for any claim to be quickly politicized in the ways that we're talking about, because any reason given for the claim can be automatically seen as suspect. And because we often understand political claims in virtue of the reasons that could or might be given for them, even if they're not given, then disagreement over those state reasons and standards of reasons can lead to politicization of almost any claim. I think, let me make a distinction here. Doug, you asked whether we're using this as a different sense of politics. I don't think so. I think when I say that, when I talk about what makes a political, I was giving a little proto-theory about what makes a political judgment. I didn't give the theory, but I was sort of sketching that there's a question there. What makes a political judgment, as opposed to another sort of judgment? And I was saying its function, how it functions in context, and not as content. And that's a way of trying to get at this point, that actually a proposition that is neither political or not political, it doesn't contain any political concepts. It's not about justice and equality, right? It's just a proposition about climate change or masks. Mask wearing lowers the rate of infection. That is unfortunately become a political judgment in the United States. Now, there's a separate question. There's one question of whether that is functioning as a political judgment in this particular context. And then there's the question of whether it should. Those are different questions. And then there's a third issue about what it means to say in context that a judgment is political. To claim that a judgment is political in a context is itself a political judgment. And you need a theory of political judgment that allows you to understand that fact. That the claim that something is a political judgment, which is on its surface should not be a political judgment. This is different than, for example, in ethical theory, I think. I mean, there's debate about this, meta-ethics, but the question of whether a claim is an ethical judgment is generally seen as meta-ethics, not ethics, not normative ethics. But in politics, that's not the way it works. In politics, to claim that a judgment is political is to make a political judgment, to make a move on the political landscape. That is something that we really need to grapple with when we're thinking about the truth or falsity of political judgments. And in order to grapple with that question, we need to think about what a political judgment is. And the danger of all this is the one that Maria is laying out, which is that we often say, as a matter of politics, that judgments that shouldn't be described as political are political. And sometimes by saying that, we make it come true. That's the weird thing about politics. It's aspirational. We work to make our aspirations come true in politics, including our aspirations about how we should talk to one another and describe our views about politics. Sorry, I got a little passionate there.
I have a quick question for you, if I might just jump in there.
And I noticed that Cailin is in now.
Sorry.
Cailin is also here, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
So my question actually has to do with what you've been saying about people conforming as far as to a particular, political claim or view or social claim or view. And you've been talking a lot about the Schaffner-Lux results regarding conformity bias and such. But I wonder, and this has been actually something that part of the chat that's been going on over the last couple of minutes. I wonder if there's a way in which you can kind of distinguish between the group, right, and the group beliefs, right? Because we've been talking a lot about how Trumpists, right, view the world, or Republicans, or conservatives, or however you want to call it, and the individual. And I asked that in earnest of each of you because there's been other work in social psychology of labs showing that if you even just marginally, right, compensate individuals, as an individual, right, and ask them, what you really believe, right, not whether you're agreeing or not with a group, they kind of come around and then they accept the facts as fact, as truth. And so I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit more from each of you about, whether there's this distinction between groups and individuals, and whether or not we can, distinguish to get around these problems that we've encountered.
I've been talking a lot, so I'd be more than happy to have my fellow co-panelists dive into that question. I have things to say about it, but it's an important question. But
maybe Cailin can jump in if she's ready.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, everyone, for showing up late. I'm in California, and my office is my bedroom, so I can't start things too early. So, yeah, regarding this idea of like group belief or individual belief, I'm not sure what everyone has been talking about so far, but maybe one thing that's come up is that with conformity bias, you may have people acting in a way that doesn't reflect maybe some of their underlying beliefs or suspicions, saying things that maybe don't reflect some of their underlying beliefs or suspicions, and acting differently in different contexts depending on who can see them and who can hear what they're saying, right? So you can have situations like you're describing in a study where people, when they're under the eyes or perceive themselves to be under the eyes of others, might say something that conforms, and in another situation where they aren't under like others' observation, say something that they believe to be true. But I'll point out there's other evidence that at least sometimes conformity and in-group signaling, it's a little hard to know where the borders of these things are. So there are studies also where people will say things that are clearly not true, but seem to be functioning as some sort of statement of in-groupism. So right after the 2016 election in the US, there was this really interesting study where they showed people pictures of Obama's inauguration crowd and Trump's inauguration crowd. And there were objectively more people in the Obama crowd. And they'd ask, well, which picture has more people in it? This is something where you can just see the answer looking right there. It's obvious. But a lot of Trump supporters would say, well, Trump's picture has more people in it. And it's not like they're in a big group where everyone's going to hear what they're saying, but they're still expressing something about, you know, an in-group membership or a desire to conform or to make a political statement or something. So I just thought that might be something interesting to think about along those lines.
So let me just jump in there. Right, Cailin, I think that's right on, and this is one of the things that Maria, in fact, that very study of Schaffner and Lux is one of the things that we've been chewing over, and I think this question of what context you're in, like whether there are people that are, you know, as you put it, listening, who's listening in, you know, if you're answering your phone from a pollster in your living room and there's your husband or a partner right there, right, listening to you, how are you going to respond? Those are questions. But as you said, the Schaffner and Lux really gets at this question of whether our political judgments, Joe, are, whether they're formed, whatever sort of group dynamic that may be going on, whether they're generally expressing our beliefs as opposed to things like our convictions or our aspirations about how the world ought to be, whether or not we think that's how it is. And you're right that those things can come apart. And it's interesting, these studies of that try to pry those things apart, try to pry, right, what I call the convictions apart from beliefs. And sometimes you can't do that. I mean, it depends on the person, right? But I think convictions often do come apart from our beliefs. Cailin, what I was calling a conviction is a commitment to an identity reflecting value, a commitment to that reflects the kind of person you want to be, the kind of world you want to live in, what kind of group you want to be associated with, even if you don't have the courage of your convictions. That is, you don't always live up to being the kind of person you want to be. The convictions are not necessarily belief states. So I don't know if that helps, Joe, as well. But Cailin, I also just like to hear more from you about like where we've been talking about how to understand political polarization and misinformation, and those of you work on that stuff. I really like your work. So I'd just love to hear how you might come at some of these general issues, you know, that we've been chatting on, you know.
Yeah, I'd be happy to say a little bit. I mean, one little thing, I wonder, this notion of conviction. So the term I was using, in-group signaling, sounds a little bit related to that, but I'm thinking of it as like a way to transfer information about who you are to others.
Yes, exactly.
Efficiently, right? Like
exactly.
If I say there's more people in this crowd, it also tells you that probably I'm comfortable with your guns and, you know, like maybe I don't believe in evolutionary theory, like different things about me, and something about what sort of social relationship we can stand in. So for like the approach that I've sort of been taking to thinking about polarization and people being in really different worlds as far as beliefs and what they think is true, So a lot of my work involves using models like computer simulations to study these kinds of questions. And one thing I thought would be interesting to bring up here is what you find using these models is that there are a lot of sufficient but different processes by which you can get polarization in a group. And actual polarization is probably the result of many of these different kinds of factors. But in a model, you can get polarization just alone by having different information sources, so something representing like really partisan news sources, having people effectively creating echo chambers where they start disconnecting with those who hold different beliefs and end up in kind of isolated groups. So that's a second way. Having conformity bias, so people who are connected but have different positions in a social network and are trying to conform to different groups. So that's a third way that you can sufficiently get polarization. Fourth, having people who have trust dynamics where they don't trust those who hold different opinions from each other. So they no longer will pick up evidence or beliefs from those who they perceive to be too different from them in belief states. And fifth, having those same trust dynamics, but based on other things like social group identity or political group identity or something like that. So those are 5 different ways you can get polarization in a model, people holding stable different beliefs or taking stable different actions. And I just think that's something interesting to think about, especially when you're thinking about how you might intervene on systems where people are polarized or really disagreeing or living in different truths.
Cailin,
go ahead, Doug, of course.
I was just curious to know whether, whether on those models, whether there's features of the world that we live in now, in this particularly in the last few years, that have made that a lot worse, or whether those you can find examples that kind of go back, that this is a problem that we've been dealing with for a long time.
Well, I mean, I think all the phenomena like this that we're seeing exacerbated by social media do go back, and you can find examples going back very far. But then you can still say there are new things now that seem to be putting fuel on the fire, right? Or pushing things further. And so related to those different kind of pathways by which you can get polarization, I mean, partisan news seems to be a bigger thing in a number of countries right now. Certainly in the US, it's become more prevalent than it was, say, 30 years ago. This ability to connect or disconnect from who you want to is something that is especially easy on social media, and a lot of people have noted this. It's really easy to pick people who share your beliefs and to just disconnect from others who don't. We're also seeing in a number of countries like Brazil and the US, these trust dynamics going to really far extremes where there's just a huge amount of distrust from anyone who's like perceived to be a political other on the other side. And so a huge amount of unwillingness to engage with evidence or information coming from those who are like politically different. And that change in trust is, it has probably a lot of causes of its own, but that also seems to be something that's legitimately worse right now than it is at some other times.
I think, one question I had for you, Cailin, is just when you think about trust, that's a notion that, obviously, like other really cool philosophical notions, like truth, has a lot of complexity to it. And it's not something, it's one of those notions that I have, throughout my career, keep telling myself, I need to come back to that notion, right? Karen Jones has been doing such good work on it. So what are, you were mentioning different dimensions of trust. Do you think that there's a kind of particularly epistemic notion of trust that is salient here, or just could you say more about what you think about trust? I'm really just, because you're here, I don't know, I'm just wanting to pick your brain about that, about some of these things that you said.
Yeah, well, I won't have anything insightful to say about like what is trust in some really core fundamental way. but I can say that, you know, there are notions of trust that, again, you can kind of put into a simple model and see that that alone gets you bad epistemic outcomes or polarization. So one notion that you might think of this as an operationalization of trust, you know, a way to make precise something like trust in a model to study it, is if people refuse to engage with evidence from certain people, but not others, right? So that could be a kind of lack of trust. You tell me, here's some evidence. I say, I'm just not even going to try to uptake that or think about it because I don't trust you as a source of evidence, right? So that's one thing that alone can kind of lead to polarization if I'm doing that systematically for people in certain political groups or who don't share my beliefs. Another way that I would operationalize trust in a model is not taking up, so we can separate kind of shared evidence and shared testimony, right? I could say to you, did you hear about this study? And you could ignore that. But I could also say to you, I think masking is stupid, and you could ignore that, right? And so that's another kind of slightly different way to mistrust others, is to not change your opinions based on their testimony or opinions.
Right.
Like I'm saying, I'm not getting at like some core philosophical notion there. I'd be curious.
And Maria, part of your project is on trust. Do you have any?
That's right. Yeah. Yes. We are just thinking about trust all the time, and it is really a very difficult concept, despite some great work that has been done by Karen Jones, among others, Catherine Howley, etc. But I want to start with something that I find quite difficult to cope with philosophically, and that is the tension that exists about externalist notions of reason and the sort of issues that Cailin was talking about. So at least since Kant, if not before that, there has been this conception of reason that involves confirmation by a community of reasoners. That is the only criteria we might have for thinking that we are reasoning correctly, is that we are in community with others. And that has been accepted by many philosophers. As I said, Kant probably was the first to voice it, but of course in 20th century and 21st century it has become a favored view of reason, etc., rather than internalist and private notions of reason. So obviously we cannot think in community with everyone. We have to choose our communities, and that's where notion of values, etc., comes in. And then that connects with trust. So standard definition, the one that's quite popular, down to us from Annette Bayer, that trust is reliance plus. And then what is that plus? Well, in take a risk, in trusting we make ourselves vulnerable. Then we have to choose who we make ourselves vulnerable to. And obviously it would be people who are less likely to harm us. That's how you avoid the harm of trust, and or the potential harm of trust. And our in-group, the ones whose values are similar to us, the ones who care for us emotionally or in terms of ideology, etc., would be the obvious group to trust. So if you put these two things together, which are perfectly legitimate concerns, one is externalism, thinking with a community in order to make sure that we think correctly, plus the requirements of trust, you do get the sort of polarization that Cailin was talking about, and it seems almost unavoidable. Now, that sort of polarization has been helped in recent times through internet, etc. But it seems to be a feature of both our reasoning and our trust. So, in that pessimistic note, I'd like to see what you think about these views.
Right. I'll let Cailin go first.
Oh no, please go ahead.
Yeah. So right. I mean, there is this question, I mean, I think that is sort of capturing one of the sort of, as you put it, pessimistic sort of consequences of thinking about the role of rationality and trust. And that in a lot of ways, I mean, one way to think about this is that what I was calling our convictions, we were talking about as sort of our in-group signaling, right? That's one of the roles that convictions play. Convictions can make it practically rational from the point of view of self-interest, from the point of view of avoiding harm, to be epistemically irrational, right? To be not trust certain evidence that's right there in front of your face, as it were, right? To push away sources that, despite overwhelming evidence that those sources are reporting things as they are, you can, because of this, the role that convictions play in the relationship to our self-identity, if a conviction is reflecting my aspirational self, the kind of person I want to be, then I'm going to push away things that are inconsistent with that, and people that are espousing views inconsistent with that. And that both is practically rational, that is rational from the point of view of self-interest, but epistemically irrational. And I think that is unfortunate, to put it mildly. But it is also maybe just a fact of the human condition. I mean, part of what we're dealing with here is we're trying to grapple with the fact that much of the situation we find ourselves in, despite it becoming worse in the ways that Cailin remarked, 5 or 6 different ways she remarked, a lot of this is coming from the roots of human psychology. We are hardwired, it seems, to be epistemically irrational in certain ways. And that, to go back to earlier discussion, makes it even more questionable how we can even talk about truth in the realm of politics. Something, by the way, just so Cailin doesn't misunderstand me, I think we definitely can. I just think it's really difficult to figure out how truth and politics can go together. I don't know if that responded, Maria, to your point, but that's how I was sort of translating it in my own obscure little language.
Just to, sort of riff a little bit. I mean, in thinking about these situations where people have groups who they consider, these are members of my in-groups, they're sort of epistemic peers, people who I will trust, who I'll take evidence from, and then others who aren't. Thinking about this from a perspective of rationality or irrationality can be really tricky, which I think is something you're both pretty responsive to, because you can have meta beliefs that make it perfectly rational in some sense to mistrust those outside your group. Like, they aren't listening to good news sources, or right, they were influenced by industry who was trying to convince them that climate change wasn't real, or they were influenced by a politician I don't trust, like, whoever. And so those meta beliefs can put you into a state where ignoring evidence from someone else is rational kind of on that level. There's a reason why you don't think they're a good epistemic source, right? A good source of information. But on a higher level, we can look at a whole group and say, well, what's happening here is irrational in the sense that it's not a good epistemic group. Things are going wrong.
So can I float, thinking about that, just maybe more depressing explanation or suggestion that maybe what we're seeing now just is how things are and have always been. We had a dream, the rationalist dream coming from Plato of thinking that, and Kant of thinking that we are rational creatures. And as a result, democracy is constructed on this kind of idea about a space of reasons that we deliberate and debate. But that's just a dream, it's a fantasy. Deep down, we've always been these, emotionally driven creatures. And whilst we might delude ourselves into thinking that, we pursue truth and we seek to engage in discussion with those that disagree with us, that's not really what we want, and it's not really what we've ever wanted. And the situation we find ourselves in now is exactly the one that we should expect to find ourselves in, given our evolutionary history. So if that's the case, what we're trying to push back against, I suppose, if we're worried about polarization, is something deep rooted within us. It's pushing back against the fear of people outside of the groups that we trust, and we're trying to almost deprogram ourselves to become, creatures that can operate in this kind of more idealized sort of political environment. And I guess my question is first of all, is that just too pessimistic, right? Or and secondly, if it's not, how do we deprogram ourselves and how can we rise above that sort of programming?
Well, okay, that was a good session. I think we're out of time now. It's a shame that we're not going to be able to answer that question. Okay, really, okay, see you guys.
I'm afraid I'm somewhat in agreement with Doug's pessimistic view that people do tend to value emotions, and personal interest, group values, etc., over and above truth and rationality in many circumstances. So as philosophers, we may have overestimated the role and importance of truth, objectivity, rationality, etc. However, having said that, the world itself has a way of biting people who don't respect truth back. So this is happening, unfolding in front of our eyes in America. You can undermine truth as much and evidence, etc., as much as you want, but the COVID-19 virus is not going to listen to you. It is going to make you sick, and that's something that will force people to respond to facts, regardless of their values, etc. I was listening to a nurse giving account of her patients who are nearly dying of COVID-19 still deny that this is an illness that is real, and saying that, oh, maybe it's lung cancer. They preferred a worse illness to COVID in order just to hold on to their conception of reality. But that will disappear as the numbers of death grow, as the illness spreads, etc. So whatever our propensities towards irrationality or putting values ahead of truth or emotions ahead of truth, the world doesn't work that way. And in order for us to succeed in the world, we will need to act according to how the world is and not just what we value. So that's my less pessimistic take on the relationship between truth and what we do.
So Maria and you and I agree a lot on these things. Yeah, go ahead, Cailin. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, I agree with Maria that people are sensitive to evidence, at least to some degree in some cases. Though I've almost been thinking about writing an op-ed or something about COVID, I was so wrong. It turns, because, in previous work I've said, well, in these cases where the facts really come to bite you in the ass, you shouldn't see all the social stuff mattering as much to people's beliefs. And here's a case where, sorry, I got a little choked up when you were and yet America is seeing the consequences. People can make a choice and be dead in 3 weeks, and yet you still don't see that convincing people. So somehow, despite this extremely good evidence, extremely serious consequences, the world pushing back really hard, in this case, we're continuing to see how, I guess, I would say the importance of social matters is trumping the evidence. Just one more small note in response to Doug and this issue you brought up, and the idea of deprogramming people out of in-group, out-group mentality. I'll just point out, sometimes that's definitely something we want to do, but it's not that's something we can just let go of and have epistemically good groups, because there are lots of people who have bad epistemic standards and bad information and bad beliefs who would mislead us. I mean, you don't want to get people to a situation where they're trusting everyone, because then they're also trusting the Flat Earth Society. And so it's a question of like, how do you get people to tune their trust to the sort of quality of epistemic sources, which is always extremely difficult and like something that's hard even for experts to do.
So great points. I agree with both of you. I do think that COVID has shown that convictions matter in politics in the ways that I've been talking about, that aspirations are more powerful often than beliefs. And aspirations are even more powerful sometimes than reality itself on motivating human behavior. To Doug's point, a question about, you know, what is this does this show that we have to reprogram, or does it, as he's suggesting, have we come across the hard truth that the idea that rationality and truth should matter in politics is a fantasy, constructed perhaps, maybe in the Enlightenment, that we really need to just sort of give up on. I'm not suggesting that Doug himself is saying that that is true, but he's raising that as a problematic. I think, in a way, what I think that myself, I think that democracy, as I've been saying earlier, is you know, rationality and truth are fundamental democratic values. And the way they think that what that means, that operationalizes what that means is not that everybody in the democracy values truth or rationality or even cares. It's that democracies, qua democracies, have a special interest in protecting and promoting and providing access to the mechanisms and institutions and practices that help us pursue truth. It has a special interest in that because democracies have an interest in having informed citizens. They have an interest in, or should have an interest in, epistemic justice. That is, constructing institutions and spaces of reasons where voices of a variety of different identities can be heard, and experiences and evidence that come from a variety of different perspectives can be listened to. Democracies have those interests, and I think, so I think really, Doug, and this is what I mean earlier, by saying this is both a theoretical question and an existential political question. Because the question of whether we're going to make sense of truth and rationality as mattering to democracy is really the question for me of whether democracy is possible. I mean, it's perhaps not a coincidence that there's a good amount of data from Pew and elsewhere that people in the United States have, more and more people, not majority of people, but a larger and larger amount of people are starting to question whether democracy really is the best form of government. And it's not surprising, on my view, that that is happening while we're also seeing this rise of polarization and rise of this sort of undermining of the valuing of truth and reliable social epistemic practices that Maria was talking about. Because the two go hand in hand. So democracy is a dream. Democracy is precisely a dream that is an aspiration, that is a hope, that has always been bucking the trend, the facts of human psychology. I mean, that's what makes it such a beautiful idea, is that it's trying to get us to get involved in institutions and practices that run against the grain. So, you know, that's, in a way, I think that's, we need to recommit ourselves to democracy and social hope, as Rodi might have said.
So if I can add one more element to what Michael was saying, I completely agree with you, Michael, on this. One more element is this element, the notion of trust, the essential role of trust in a democracy. You cannot run a democracy without public trust. And the attempt, the very successful attempt, I think, to undermine trust, which started by some well-known media outlets in the United States and in Australia as well, to lesser extent in Britain, but very successfully in Britain as well. And then it has been voiced so vocally by Trump and his allies. That undermining of trust is actually identical with the attempt to undermine democracy. This is one and the same thing, and we should be aware that it's not just not trusting New York Times as fake news, etc. It's really not trusting the whole democratic apparatus that has been in place after a great deal of effort by many people over centuries.
Exactly.
Can I step in for a second? Because Michael brought up the some of the research that Pew's done on polarization and about attitudes on democracy, and I was poking around in there getting ready for this session, and one thing really struck me. There's a series of animated graphics that are intended to show polarization, and they have these nice sort of spreading bell curves of blue and red. But one thing that I did is I looked at the aggregate data for the total population, not broken down by party. And what you have is you have this sort of shift in the pre-polarized universe of 1994, if that even exists, of sort of a nice centrist bell curve for the general population. And now what we have is a flattening, right? It's not that when you look at the entire population that you see these sort of really significant humps on either end. What you have is sort of a flattening, a distribution of the population more or less equally over these sort of aggregate viewpoints. And so one worry I have that's in line with these questions about democracy is, shouldn't it be possible for a democratic system to create a space in which a multipolar, a non-polar community can interact and engage in politics together, as opposed to this sort of presupposition we have that there are sort of these two sort of more or less monolithic or in some cases multi-party systems, sort of multipolar things going on. But I'm sort of calling into question here the very notion that polarization is sort of an accurate description of the situation rather than just sort of a flattening and a de-consensusizing, and a disappearance of consensus about certain things rather than an actual polarization. So what do you guys think about that notion that polarization might be the wrong way to approach this?
I'm going to leave that to the experts, Mike.
So I'll just point out that when people talk about polarization, it often tracks many, many different states of belief, attitude, whatever. There's a nice paper by Daniel Singer and Patrick Grimm's working group where they tried just to identify what are distributions of beliefs that would count as polarized and how, and go through all the kind of different ways you could have a distribution. I mean, when you try to model this stuff, you have to find ways of saying what counts as getting more polarized. I have a student who says, like, the further beliefs get away from some truth that we've identified in the model, the more polarized it is. But that could be a flattening rather than, as you're talking about, a blue and a red curve at different places. So I think it depends. Does this count as polarization? It depends what you're talking about. It depends, what sort of thing you're trying to get or you're trying to avoid. Sometimes polarization counts as stable camps with two different beliefs. Sometimes it is what you're talking about, just beliefs that are getting further away from some central consensus. And so I would count that as a kind of polarization. But also, I think something that you're kind of bringing up here is that sometimes maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe polarization doesn't matter in every case. The cases it probably matters are where it's really interfering with democratic functioning. And some of those cases are ones where there's polarization about matters of fact, where there ought to be a consensus about a matter of fact. So, disagreement, skepticism about climate change or vaccines, those are classic cases where it's really causing a problem. And then polarization where like emotion, mistrust, hatred, all of these sort of bad feelings towards other groups or people who hold different beliefs is at play, that's obviously very pathological and causes huge problems. But there can be other cases where people just have different beliefs and it's not actually a big problem for democratic functioning.
If I can make a practical point rather than a philosophical one, it seems to me, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone because this is a political point, a political science point, but it seems to me that polarization is helped by a two-party political system, as in the US, and to a lesser extent in Britain. When you look at the European models, including Ireland, where there are many parties and you have a preferential voting system that you vote for many, many people for the same point, but you rank them in preferences, then coalitions become inevitable. We have had coalitions of 5, 6 parties together. The system imposes that on you. And then when you have coalitions, then you have less polarization. So part of the problem lies in the political system playing out in actual fact in the United States and other countries that operate on two-party system, and maybe changing that could help lessen the ill effects of polarization that Cailin mentioned.